Welcome.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you very much for having me. Um, 20 minutes or 30 minutes, we'll see what happens. I need to try and explain what's gone wrong with the world and how we can fix it. And 20 minutes should be enough, but you never quite know. Um, First of all, Collaboration Global, how could I possibly refuse to speak at something called Collaboration Global? Collaboration Global, those are the two words that best describe everything I've spent the whole of my adult career on. So it's a little bit spooky. Let me explain what I mean by this. So as Jill said, my day job for the last 20 years or so is I'm a policy advisor. I work with presidents, prime ministers, occasionally monarchs and governments of lots of countries, about 58 or 59 at the last count, all over the world, big and small, rich and poor, near and far. And what I do is I try to help by working with the leadership of these countries. I try to help them figure out how they can engage more productively with the rest of the world, with the international community, how they can make better use of the good parts of globalization. And sometimes that's quite practical stuff, how they can get more trade, more investment, more tourism, and all of the stuff that keeps the economy flowing. Sometimes it's more defensive stuff. It's about defense, it's about security. Sometimes it's more about cultural relations with other countries, how they can exchange their cultural past and their cultural abilities and spread the love of culture around the planet a bit. Often it's about people, how they can attract the best talent, how they can absorb more migrants and refugees within their country, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very broad topic, but a very important one because we do have a sort of international community out there. Last time I checked, there were 200 or more countries. And unless we can figure out how to engage with each other productively and imaginatively and creatively, then our problems tend to multiply instead of diminishing. And this is where collaboration comes in, because I'd been doing this job for several years, 3 or 4 or 5 years, before I noticed that a strange thing was happening. One of the things that happens whenever I go into a new country is that they tell me about their problems. And in fact, I ask them about their problems. What is it that's bothering you? A little bit like the doctor who, when a patient comes into the surgery, says, where does it hurt? And so my first question to most governments is, where does it hurt? Why am I here? And very often they complain about issues which are threatening the stability or the prosperity of their country, now or in the near future, or sometimes in the distant future, but more often in the immediate future. And I ask to speak to the experts who can explain to me what it's all about. And this is the luck of my job. I get to speak to all of these experts, and some of them aren't just national, they're global experts on climate change, on migration, on poverty, on inequality and education, security threats, whatever it may be. And after about 4 years, I suddenly had a realization that what these experts were telling me was always familiar to me. I'd stopped hearing new problems after about 4 years. None of the problems that any of these experts ever told me about was one I hadn't heard before somewhere else. And I suddenly realized there are no more domestic problems anymore. They're all international to some degree. So at this stage in our development as the human species, all of our problems have become globalized, have become internationalized. You push them down in one country and they pop up in another. It's like the game of whack-a-mole. So Mexico suffers from drug trafficking, but that's not a Mexican problem. It's a global problem. It stretches from Afghanistan in the east to Canada in the north. Everywhere somebody is affected by and is part of the system of narco trafficking. And if you succeeded by some miracle in pushing it down in Mexico, all that would happen would be that it would pop up next door. In fact, part of the reason why Mexico's got such a big problem at the moment was because the Americans and the Colombians were so effective at pushing it down in Colombia. This is just the way things work. We live in an age where we are massively interconnected and interdependent. There's no such thing as a domestic issue any longer. And one of the consequences of that fact is that all the challenges that humanity is facing today, climate change, pandemics, poverty, inequality, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, small arms proliferation, human rights abuses, illiteracy, you name it. I mean, give me 30 seconds and I could give you a list of 30 of these problems. They are all bigger than any single country can resolve. There's no country on earth that is big enough to tackle any of those problems on its own. America can't fix climate change. Europe, the continent of Europe, cannot fix migration. China can't fix poverty and inequality. So self-evidently, the only way that we're going to save humanity and save the planet and move forwards through this dangerous age and perhaps one day even pass it is if countries work together to tackle these problems, because we can't do it alone. And they don't. So what I would always say to these experts whenever I went into their countries was I would say, but do we know the solution to this problem, whichever problem it was the expert was talking about? Do we know the solution to climate change? Do we know the solution to migration? Do we know the solution to lawlessness or whatever it is? And the expert would always say, oh yeah, we know the solution. We know the solutions to all of the problems facing us. So I would say in my kind of slightly naive way, so how come we haven't fixed it? And they would say, oh, it's a question of resources. We don't have the resources. We know the solution, but we don't have the resources to make it work. And I would say to them, but surely, if this is the main problem that your population and your nation, your territory is facing at this point in history, you could make the resources available. And they would say, no, no, Simon, you don't get it. We don't have the resources available in our economy. We just don't have that kind of money to fix this. So I'd say, well, why don't you work with some other countries that have got the same problem, pool your resources, do it together? And that's the point where the expert would smile a bit sadly and say, ah, if only. Unfortunately, we're not in office for long enough to carry out the delicate negotiations and persuasion that would be necessary to get other countries to work with us on this problem, even though it's shared. And so we don't move forwards. And so climate change and poverty and inequality and all of these dangers facing us, the dangers which mean that our own children and grandchildren possibly won't have a stable, peaceful, just world to live in, they don't get solved. The reality is that we have the wrong culture of governance. What happens is that countries are configured to compete, as they have been pretty much forever. The way I see it is that humanity, the story of humanity, basically goes in 3 ages. From the remote past until probably the end of the Second World War, you could say that we lived in the age of conflict. It was all about countries, and before countries, city-states and empires fighting each other for territory, for blood, for treasure. Thank heavens, after the shattering experience of 2 world wars, we finally started figuring out how to get beyond the age of constant conflict. And we moved into the age that we're in at the moment, which is the age of competition. It's basically still the same rules as the age of conflict. It's basically still about each country trying to achieve ascendancy over other countries, trying to do better. And it's still wrong for the same reasons that conflict was wrong. Because if we're fighting each other, if we're treating life on Earth as if it were a sprint to the finish where there's one winner and everybody else loses, then we all lose. Life on Earth isn't a sprint to the finish. Life on Earth is a team sport. And unless we figure out that all the countries and cities and actors in the international arena work together collaboratively to make things work, it ain't going to work. And so what we need to do is we need to move into the 3rd age of humanity, which is the age of collaboration, where we spontaneously, instinctively work together, cooperate and collaborate first, and then maybe compete on top of that. Because don't get me wrong, I don't really have a problem with competition. Competition is fine. Competition is a useful and instinctive energy of the human animal. It's very, very deep inside us, and it's useful if it's used in the right way, if it's channeled wisely and responsibly. Competition has been responsible for lifting billions of people out of poverty, and no doubt will continue to do so. Competition is only a problem when it becomes the only altar at which we worship. And that's been the story of humanity since, well, the early 20th century. And so what we need to do is we need to reverse that paradigm. So the fundamental instinct of all countries is first to collaborate and then to compete. And the funny thing is we know this works because industry has been modeling this solution back since the 1970s. I think it was Japanese automobile manufacturers who introduced back in the 70s to the world an idea called co-opetition. The idea that you can compete, collaborate, and work together all at the same time. And it works. And it benefits the whole industry. It's a rising tide which benefits all the ships. Nobody loses competitive advantage just because they're also collaborating. It helps the whole system. So the experiment of co-opetition is an experiment that is 30, 40, 50 years overdue in the public sector, in the world of government. There are really only two problems in the world. And despite the long lists that I started listing before, what I've discovered is that if you think about this long enough and you take a big step back and you look at the Earth as if it were that pale blue dot from the Voyager photograph, you can see that actually all of those challenges that we worry about, we obsess about so endlessly, whether it's climate change or pandemics or anything else, are really nothing much more than symptoms of two underlying problems. The first one is the culture of governance, as I've said, the fact that we're configured to compete first and forget collaboration most of the time. So we need to change the culture of governance worldwide from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative, and then we're on our way to fixing things. Now, that's a great big change. To change the fundamental culture of governance is huge. It's not enough for me and people like me who have the ears of people who run countries to tell them that this is what they need to do, no matter how strong the arguments, because the reality of the matter is that it doesn't work. And I realized after doing this job for about 20 years that I'd be 963 before I achieved on my own any form of measurable change in the way that governments see the way they're supposed to govern. And the sad truth is that they finally started to get it when it was too late for them to do anything about it. But I found myself thinking, there are two things wrong with the world, and they fit together. One of them is the way that countries behave, and the other one is the way that people behave. Now, you say that, you've said everything and you've said nothing, but the simple fact of the matter is that all of the challenges facing humanity at this point in our history are caused by the behavior of human beings. Whether it's climate change or pandemics or anything else, that's us that's done that. That's our omissions and our commissions. And what causes the behavior of human beings? Where do we get these behaviors from? Well, it's what we learn or what we fail to learn when we're at school or before we go to school. Fundamentally, it's about education. And so this is why I found myself saying quite a lot to people at the moment. Look, we've now got the vaccines against the pandemic, but where's the vaccine for climate change? Where's the vaccine for war? Where's the vaccine for terrorism and racism and prejudice? Well, we've got a vaccine for all of those too. It's called education. And we've had it for centuries. And we've been testing it for centuries, and we know that it works, and we've known that for centuries. If you teach climate change in schools in Sweden, you produce a child called Greta Thunberg, who before she's even left school is a more effective advocate against climate change than any of us have been in our adult lives. That's what education does. Most of us up until the age of Greta Thunberg were never taught anything that's really relevant or useful to the actual state of the globalized world that we're living in today, with our globalized challenges and our would-be globalized solutions. We really need to change the way we bring up our kids. And I think what we need to do is we need to treat this actually as a vaccine program. Because just like the vaccines against the pandemic, the problem with our extraordinary abilities as a human species is not coming up with solutions. We're really good at that. The problem is distributing them. So just as the problem facing us with the pandemic at the moment is the distribution of the vaccines worldwide, because if we can't distribute it to everybody, then we might as well distribute it to practically nobody, because unless everybody's vaccinated, COVID is still around. And the same applies to every other challenge that humanity is facing today. We need to find ways of distributing the vaccine of education to every single child. And if we can do that, then we can fix all the world's problems, not just one of them, and we can do it in one generation. So in my book, I tell the story of a project which I'm in the process of launching at the moment, which is a very simple project. In essence, it's called The Good Generation. And the idea is that we use education to create a new generation of human beings who will run towards the global challenges instead of running away from them, as our generations have done. And the way that we do that is by having a big online global conversation between children and teachers and parents and experts from every single one of the 200 odd countries on the planet, and try and figure out what are the fundamental values and virtues and principles that we all agree we want all of our children to absorb while they're at school and before and after, so that they have the ability to actually deal with the planet that they inherit from us. It was interesting because this thought first occurred to me when I'd spent a couple of very depressing days studying the websites of a lot of NGOs and other assorted Save the World organizations. And it was very interesting because A surprising number of them used an almost identical sentence in all of their materials on their website. They would all wind up by saying at some point words to the effect of, and we must leave the world in a better state for our children. And I found myself thinking, that is so arrogant in a way, if you think about it. The idea that you can take a problem like climate change, for example, a vast structural geopolitical problem that has taken the emissions and commissions of billions of people over centuries to perpetrate, and you're going to fix it, little NGO, before you check out. That's just not realistic. And sometimes it makes you realize that that kind of impatience is almost as bad as the opposite. It's the indolence or the complacency which we so often accuse each other of. Really, what that sentence should read is not let's leave the world in a better state for our children. What it should read is let's leave our children in a better state to fix the world, because we can only do it through them and with them. Look at Greta Thunberg. One of the things that she's begun to discover very early in life is that if you want to change adult humans, it's an incredibly difficult job because they don't want to change. Once most of us have got past the age of about 30, we just know everything. And we're so committed to our worldview because it's frightening, the idea of having to unpick things and start again. Changing children, on the other hand, or molding children, to use a scary term for it, is terrifyingly easy. Always has been. Social engineering, it's sometimes called. And that's why the education of children is quite rightly, very carefully and very closely ring-fenced against outside interference. But if you have permission to do something with the educational syllabus, then it's as easy to change the attitudes of children as it is difficult to change the attitudes of adults. Greta Thunberg and her generation very obviously have absolutely the right attitude, but they don't yet have the skills and the abilities and the resources and the knowledge to put those attitudes into practice in the most effective way. We adults, many of us, we've got the skills and the resources and the knowledge. We know how to do all of these things, but we sure as hell don't have the right attitude. So you see, we really do have to work together. It's not just collaboration across borders. It's also collaboration between generations. We cannot do it. We cannot move forward without either or both of those conditions being part of the solution. So I could go on for a really long time, but I just want to tell you one little anecdote that relates to this, and then I'll leave it at that so that we can discuss. After I've been working with governments for about 20 years, and I've been having the conversations that I told you about a few minutes ago, I began to realize that the thing that most countries seemed to be absolutely obsessed with, and most countries' governments were absolutely obsessed with, was how they are viewed, their image. This seemed to be the number one obsession, and they were constantly saying to me, people don't respect our country enough. They don't know enough about us, if only. And they were right. If only people knew more about their country or respected it more, then they probably would be doing better. Because it was very clear that countries that are admired get more business. They get more investment, they get more tourism, they get more this and that. And so all the countries on earth are in a desperate race to try and improve their images. And lots of them blow billions of dollars of taxpayers and donors' money into stupid propaganda campaigns, trying to tell people how wonderful they are on the misplaced expectation that that will somehow change people's minds. So here you've got a situation where practically every country wants a better image, but they don't know how to achieve it. So I'd been researching the images of countries for more than 10 years, and I'd collected a database of more than 1 billion data points on who thinks what about which countries, perceptions. And I did some analysis of that database to try and find out, why is it then that people admire Switzerland, for example, more than they admire Myanmar? What is it? What are the fundamental ingredients of that admiration? Where does it come from? It's not propaganda, so what is it? And what the analysis told me was that the main reason why most people on the planet admire one country more than another is not because that country is more powerful or more effective or older, has got more culture or more beautiful people or a bigger land area or anything like that. It's because they think that country does more good in the world. People admire countries that appear to contribute to the world outside their own borders. And if you think about it, it's logical. If you tell me that Guatemala has the world's most wonderful state welfare system, I live in the UK, sure, that's great for Guatemala, but it doesn't benefit me. And in the end, it doesn't interest me all that much. On the other hand, if you tell me that Guatemala is teaming up with 7 of its neighbors and other countries and other parts of the world to try and put in place a new plan to cut air pollution from buses, suddenly I'm interested. Suddenly, as I go to sleep at night, I'm thinking positive thoughts about Guatemala. So being a good country, the opposite, if you like, of a selfish country, is the thing that really makes a difference. And it benefits a country's trade. This is just like corporate social responsibility all over again, but this time at the level of the nation state. Just as companies discovered 20 or 30 years ago that if they want to keep the loyalty of their customers and they want to improve their brand image and do more business, they have to be responsible members of the societies in which they operate. So I've discovered the same is true for countries. If you want to do well as a country, you have to do good. So this was why back in 2014, I decided I would try and measure how good countries really are. Which ones do contribute more to the world outside their own borders? Which ones do contribute more to the planet as a whole? Because I've always thought to myself, these days, politicians, the people who run these countries, they have a double mandate. It's not the old-fashioned single mandate that says you're responsible for your own people and your own slice of territory. You've got to do the best for them. Forget the rest because they can look after themselves. No, today, in our age of globalization, they've got a double mandate, which says you are responsible for your own people, yes, and for every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether you like it or not. You are responsible for your own slice of territory, yes, and for every square inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it and the ground beneath your feet, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't be leading a country, you shouldn't be leading anything. You should be in jail. Because the only way that humanity is going to survive and prosper is if every person in a position of power and responsibility accepts this dual mandate. So I thought to myself, maybe it's time to measure which countries are really doing the best here, because it's complicated. Countries are complicated things. They do good on Monday and they do bad on Tuesday, and parts of them are doing good and parts of them are harming, and you never really know. So I thought maybe you could do a balance sheet for the world where you could actually calculate whether we should feel glad that each country exists because of what it's doing for the world that we live in and our children and grandchildren will one day live in. And the result of that thinking was the Good Country Index. And the Good Country Index is literally a balance sheet for the countries of the world. What it does is it measures them, and indeed it ranks them. I'm trying to stimulate a little bit of helpful competition here between countries. Based on the size of your economy, how much good do you do outside your own borders? It completely ignores whatever countries do inside their own borders, not because that's unimportant. Of course it's important, but simply because that's measured in so many ways and in so many other indicators. I just didn't need to repeat all of that good work. But the thing that nobody had measured was the impact of countries outside their borders. And that just seems to be the most important question for the age that we live in today in the 2020s. Not how well is this country doing, but how much is this country doing? So I launched the first edition of the Good Country Index at a TED Talk in Berlin in 2014. And to my absolute astonishment and to the astonishment of the organizers, it did really well. And nobody was expecting it to, least of all me, because the way that people understand these things at TED is that if you give a talk, which is basically a self-help talk, how you can have more friends or get better sex or something like that, then you might get those fabled millions of views that TED Talks sometimes get. But if you're moaning about the state of the world and talking about geopolitics, which is my subject, you'll be lucky if you get a few thousand views. My TED Talk was the fastest ever TED Talk to 1 million views in their history. And it just went on and on and on and on. And today, I said 2014, 7 years later, it still gets 5,000 views every day from somewhere in the world. It's past 12 million views. Now, I'm not saying this in order to brag much, but mainly because the really interesting thing about the unexpected success of this talk was that it was also accompanied by a huge number of people writing to me. I don't know how they found my email address, but they found me. And it was people from all over the world writing in and basically all saying the same things. They were saying, I like what you said about being in a good country. I want to live in a good country. I want to hold up my chin when I walk around the world. And when people ask me where I come from, I can say, yes, I come from this country that does good for you, for us, for everyone. And that makes me feel much more proud than knowing that it's a country that makes a lot of money and looks after its own citizens. well or better than others. And they also said, I liked your talk because you seem to agree with me that the global challenges are just a bit more important than the domestic challenges. And like you, I'm not all that interested in domestic politics anymore, at least not in comparison to the global issues, because they seem less important. And like you, I look at our domestic politicians and they seem to be like overgrown school children fighting in our parliaments. And I wonder, when are they going to grow up and see what's really wrong with the world and really do something about it? And have the guts and the courage and the imagination to actually think beyond our own borders, and so on and so on. And I thought to myself, my God, these people are just like me. I wonder how many of us there are. And so I did a thing which is normally only done by sinister companies called Cambridge Analytica. And I did some psychometric analysis of the more than 20,000 emails I'd received from 175 countries around the world. And I realized there is definitely a character type going on here. All of these people who've written to me, all of these people who've watched the TED Talk and reached out because they like this idea, let's call them natural cosmopolitans. They're people who were born just instinctively believing that they're a member of the human race first, and a citizen of their own nation, at least first equal, but maybe second or third or whatever. That's their instinctive place in their world. And they grew up like that. It's a character trait. And so I did some further research because I found myself wondering how many of these people are there? I mean, the 20,000 of them who've already written to me, maybe that's the whole lot, in which case, lovely club, let's try and reach out to them and join up together and see what we can do. But if it's more, maybe that's interesting and maybe that's important. So I sat down with my colleague, Robert Govers, and we used the World Values Survey and some other data that was lying around to try and extrapolate or estimate how many people in the world are natural cosmopolitans. And we set the bar really, really high because we didn't want to exaggerate here and we didn't want to create any false hope. But we discovered that if you set the bar really, really high, it is definitely no less than 10% of the world's adult population. That's 700 million people. That would be the third largest country on earth after India and China. And a country that size could really kick some ass. Well, that was the point where I made a slightly flawed decision and decided I was going to create a new country for these 700 million people to be virtual citizens of. But never mind, that didn't work out. But it was a very, very interesting experiment because it showed to me that these people do exist and they're out there. Now, I'm not saying that they're the only people in the world who matter or anything like it. But 700 million people is a way that we can start major change, because 700 million natural cosmopolitans are absolutely, totally committed, instinctively, from the day they were born, to the idea of us being a common species, one species inhabiting one planet. That's their worldview. That's their religion, if you like. And a large number like that, if we can reach them, if we can collect them together, can make projects like the Good Generation, which I mentioned before, the educational project, even the virtual digital nation, which I piloted but never quite got around to doing. Any of these things, even resolving all of the global challenges, from climate change and pandemics right the way down to small arms proliferation and illiteracy, we can fix them all, because that's what it takes. It takes people who are naturally cosmopolitan and see themselves as citizens of the world first and citizens of their own nation second. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Simon. I'm nodding like crazy. I'm a